Hi, everybody. I'm going to lead a couple of songs as we get started, and I'm going to do it from the pulpit because that looks normal and just because I can. All right. 594 in the book is Bind Us Together. Bind Us Together. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together, Lord, bind us together with love. There is only one God, there is only one King. There is only one body, that is why we can sing. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together with cords that cannot be broken. Bind us together, Lord, bind us together, Lord, bind us together with love. And 435 in the book is Hold to God's Unchanging Hand. Just seems like the right song at the right time. Time is filled with swift transition. Naught of earth and moon can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. When your journey is completed. When your journey is completed. If to God you have been true, fair and bright the hope in glory, your enraptured soul will view. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Hold to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Hold to God's unchanging hand. All right, I'm going to go sit down for the duration. So it'll take me a minute, I'll be there. And we're back. If you remember, about 12 weeks ago, maybe 13 now, we were preaching a series of sermons through the Gospel of Mark. And while I've been away, we've had several different wonderful sermons from Greg and others, and appreciate all that they did. I want to try to get back this morning to the Gospel of Mark. So we are in chapter 8, if you want to grab a Bible or grab your phone. And we're going to be the first half of the 8th chapter of Mark this morning. Do you ever think about why Jesus chose to do certain miracles and chose not to do others? This last section that we covered in the New Testament class across the street, we talked about 4 major reasons why Jesus did miracles. Number 1 was to confirm that Jesus really was from God. When the Jewish people thought about Messiah, they thought about somebody who would be very powerful. So if Jesus had showed up and he'd been a good teacher, good preacher, but had not had any kind of miraculous abilities, it would have been a great deal more difficult to convince the people that he really was from God. Right? They would expect God's Messiah to be miraculous. The second one is that it is to identify Jesus as the Messiah or the Christ. And this one you can find in Scripture. They look at the things that he does and they compare him to the things that he says. And at least the common people come up with the equation, he must be the Messiah. Will the Messiah do more things than this man does? How can he not be Messiah? The third one is to secure the attention of the people. Right? He's trying to teach them something, and as they gather together, he does a miracle, and they definitely are going to want to hear the things that he has to say. And then finally, and this one has more to do with today's lesson, he wanted to demonstrate his compassion. There are certain miracles that have no other explanation than Jesus felt sorry for them. They needed something and he supplied it for them. My favorite one has always been the widow who lived at Nain. Her husband, of course, was already gone, and she had lost her only son. They were leaving the city of Nain to take him out to the tombs, and Jesus was coming in the gate as they were going out the gate. So Jesus stops the procession and takes the young man, raises him from the dead, and gives him back to his mom. Right? Now, he's going to die again. The mom's going to die. This isn't an eternal fix for anything. But this woman had a need, and he took care of the need. Another one you might think about is the woman who had the issue of blood for 12 years. She sneaks up behind Jesus and touches the hem of his garment. She needed compassion. It was just what was needed in her life. It wasn't to prove a point. It wasn't to get everybody to follow him. It was just because there was a need. Right? So when you get to Mark chapter 8, we have the second of two mass feedings. The first one was the feeding of the 5,000 by the Sea of Galilee. Now we have a record of a feeding that included 4,000 men. Very few things about these accounts are different. Same kind of circumstances are going on. They have followed Jesus out into the wilderness. They haven't eaten for a while. Jesus has compassion on them. He's concerned about them, wants to make sure that they're physically okay while they're listening to the things that he wants to tell them. And as a result, you have a kind of a teaching opportunity and an opportunity for Jesus to show compassion. So we're going to read the first 10 verses of chapter 8 that just talk about this miracle. And like I said, it'll sound very familiar to you if you've read the account of the feeding of the 5,000. They're very, very similar. Okay? During those days, another large crowd gathered. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse along the way. Some of them have come a long way. His disciple answered, Where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed all these people? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7, they replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to set before the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for those also, told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterwards, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 men were present, and having sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Okay, so you see, it's the same kind of thing that happened with the 5,000. There were a lot of people. They couldn't possibly have fed them, so Jesus takes what they have, turns it into a meal for the 4,000 men. One kind of interesting thing I learned a few years ago is the difference between the 12 basketfuls that they took up after feeding the 5,000 and the 7 basketfuls that they took up after feeding the 4,000. There are 2 different words in the Greek. The word for the baskets that they took up at the feeding of the 5,000 means a small basket. So each one of the disciples had a take-home box. The meaning of the baskets at the feeding of the 4,000 is a little larger basket. So they had probably as much leftovers, just in different sized baskets. So why did Jesus do the miracle? Well, he tells you, I'm doing this because I have compassion on these people. They have a need. I can fill the need. And so he does. It was common for Jesus to work miracles among these large groups of people. But Jesus was not as willing to show his power in other groups. So that's where we're going to head for the next little section, beginning in verse 11. The Pharisees came and began to question Jesus to test him. They asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, "Why does this generation ask for a miraculous sign? I tell you the truth, no sign will be given it." Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. So all the time the Pharisees show up. All the time the Pharisees are trying to throw a monkey wrench in the gears. They think that by asking Jesus to perform a miracle, that they can get him kind of under their control, right? If we tell you to do something and you do it, even if you're capable of doing it, you did it because we invited you to do it. But they're constantly asking him about his authority. Who told you that you could do these things? Who told you that you could go out in the wilderness and feed 4,000 people? Who told you that you could go out into the wilderness and teach all these folks? Who told you that you could baptize? Who told you that you had any authority at all? And so the Pharisees keep trying to bring him to themselves, and Jesus keeps pushing them away. Now, in other parallel passages, Jesus adds a little bit to this. He says, "No sign will be given to them except the sign of the prophet Jonah. As the prophet Jonah was in the belly of the fish for 3 days, so the Son of Man will be in the belly of the earth for 3 days." So in other places, he adds that little nuance that there will be a sign, but I'm not going to do it for you now, and I'm not going to do it under your control. So there's that constant rub with the Pharisees. Well, it carries on. In verse 14, the disciples had forgotten to bring bread. Now, they had 7 big baskets of leftovers not too long ago, but for some reason now they don't have any bread. They had 1 loaf with them in the boat. "Be careful," Jesus warned them. "Watch out for the yeast." The old King James says the leaven of the Pharisees and that of Herod. Okay, the leading people, those that had the most political and spiritual clout in Jerusalem and around that area, were the Pharisees, who were the ones who found themselves to be the most righteous, and Herod, who was the puppet king in the region under the auspices of the Romans. So those groups were going to be a thorn in Jesus' flesh, both literally and physically, as time went by. So they discussed this with one another, and they said, "It's because we forgot to bring bread." The disciples just don't get it. It's kind of fun sometimes to be us 2,000 years later and look back at all the stuff that the disciples couldn't figure out. You just think, man alive, how can you miss all the things that Jesus did and all the things he said? Surely you could weave these things together. But no, they were first generation. They had never seen anything like this. They hadn't spent their whole life going to Bible class and listening to people preach and studying the scriptures for themselves. They didn't know these things. But Jesus was regularly put out with them because they weren't figuring out what he was talking about. Aware of the discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you not have eyes, or do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 12, they replied. "And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up?" 7, they said. He said to them, "So do you still not understand?" In other words, look, guys, we don't have a problem with food. That's the least of our worries. We've got lots of things we need to be concerned about, lots of things we need to work on, but whether or not we have bread to eat is not one of them. When he was talking to the woman at the well, they came up, it was a little afternoon, and they were concerned because they thought he hadn't had anything to eat. He says, "Man, I got stuff to eat you don't know about." They were constantly stuck in the physical while Jesus was trying to bring them kicking and screaming into the spiritual realm. And sometimes they crossed over, sometimes they had glimpses of the greatness, but then they would slide back into the physical. Now, let me pause for the cause just a minute. Does that sound familiar? I mean, you and I, there are days that we are mountaintop people. We've got it all figured out. We're spiritual. Things are going well. We're happy. We're praising God. And then the next day we kind of slide back down into the valley and start thinking with our physical minds instead of our spiritual minds. And we get worried. We get concerned about the way things are. We wonder if God can really take care of us. Jesus would remind us, look back through your life, take inventory. Do you remember that time that this was happening and I took care of you? Remember that time when you prayed about this and I took care of you? Remember that time when you were concerned about this and I took it all? You remember, don't you, that I've been with you all of your lives. Don't suddenly slide back into the physical and forget all of the things that I've already taught you, all of the things I've already done for you. And lest we forget, while the disciples were feeding the 5,000, they had plenty to eat. While they were feeding the 4,000, they had plenty to eat and leftovers to boot. And Jesus says, how is it that your eyes are open, but you just can't perceive the things that are going on around you? All right. So there is a rub between Jesus and the Pharisees that he wants his disciples to pick up on. He wants them to get the picture that he's never going to be a company man. He's never going to suddenly join up with the Pharisees or be sponsored by Herod. He's always going to be an outsider. And the reason for all of this is that he wants them to understand that it's an us versus them category. It is Jesus and his Father versus those who have taken over the Jewish leadership. They're not listening to the voice of God. They're not listening to Messiah. They're not leading the people toward God. They're leading the people toward themselves. And so as Jesus comes onto the planet, he's got to try to draw people away from the Jewish leadership because the Jewish leadership is not bringing people toward God. It would have been nice if the Jewish leadership had been right with God, if they had been looking for the righteousness of God instead of their own righteousness, and Jesus might have been able to work within the system. That was never the plan. Right? Jesus came as an us versus them, and I wanted to share a couple of passages about that. Look over at John chapter 8, verse 25. And this is just a very small piece of a much larger passage, so if you have a chance, after a while, maybe you go back and read all of John chapter 8. He's talking to people who have some level of faith, to a bunch of people who are kind of paying attention to him, but he's also talking to the leadership, and the leadership, of course, is an us versus them. So I'm going to read chapter 8, verses 25 through 29. Who are you? They asked. Just what I have been claiming all along, Jesus replied. I have much to say in judgment of you, but he who sent me is reliable, and what I have heard from him I tell the world. They did not understand that he was talking to them about his Father. So Jesus said, when you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am the one I claim to be, and that I do nothing on my own but speak just what the Father has taught me. The one who sent me is with me. He has not left me alone, for I always do what pleases him. And even while he was speaking, many of them put their faith in him. So this mixed group, some believing, some not believing, but Jesus says, I want you to understand, it's an us versus them. I'm with my Father. My Father sent me. My Father tells me what to say. I say what my Father tells me to say. My Father tells me what to do. I do what my Father tells me to do. And the reason that some of you are not believing, the reason that some of you are not following me, is because you're not connected to the Father. And they get into kind of a lengthy argument about being illegitimate children, right? We're the children of Abraham. Jesus says, well, God could raise up children to Abraham from the rocks. And eventually, this is the passage where Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Right? I and the Father are one. What the Father tells me to do, I do. It's an us versus them kind of thing. So beware of the Pharisees' leaven. Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees. Beware of the yeast of Herod. The way they're leading you, the things they want to infuse into your life, are not the things that you want. Okay? Now apply that to us. Sometimes there are people in the world who want to give us religious advice. Where did it come from? Right? Is it something that someone started in the 1900s? Is it something that somebody dreamed up in the 1500s? When and where did that message begin? And if it doesn't have its beginning place in God through Christ, then it's an us versus them kind of situation. If it's not from Christ, how do we know that it's from God? If it's not connected to the Father, is it something that we really want? So Jesus says, be aware of the message that you're receiving and where it's coming from, and don't let it take root in your life if it's the leaven of the Pharisees or the leaven of Herod. And then John chapter 10, verse 17. This is in a group of mixed metaphors. Jesus is talking about I am. Just got finished teaching on the I am statements of John. It's another thing that you might enjoy doing sometime. Go through it just every time Jesus uses the terms I am. Mark that in your scripture. He has at least 7 passages where that occurs. There's probably about 10 or 12 different items that he uses, different metaphors that he uses to describe himself. I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I am the way, the truth, and the life. So you're familiar with them, but sometime when you're reading through John, you might take the time to mark those. But here is John chapter 10, beginning in verse 17. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down, and I have the authority to take it up again. This is the command that I have received from my Father. This may be one of the most important things that Jesus says in Scripture concerning the us versus them. Some people are operating under the false impression that Jesus just wasn't able to finish his mission. Right? He came to the earth. He came to his own, but his own would not receive him. And so they crucified him because he failed. Right? And maybe he'll come back sometime and be successful, but he failed in his mission. Nothing could be further from the truth. Jesus knew the entire time that he was in his ministry that he was going to die. That was the purpose. One of the passages that bears that out is Jesus, from that time forward, set his face toward Jerusalem. He knew where he was going. He knew that he was going to get done when he got there. And here, he just wants his listeners to understand this is not about what the Pharisees want. This is not about what Herod wants. This is not something that Pontius Pilate is going to accomplish in his pseudo power from Rome. He tells Pilate to his face, unless my Father allowed it, you couldn't do anything to me. He understands the power that there is in being connected to his Father, right? So it was an us versus them mentality. And as we go on through the rest of Mark, what we'll see is that intensifies. And more you can see the divide between Jesus and the leadership of the Jews up until the time that he finally is able to move them to the place where he and the Father wanted to move them all along, to a place of murderous intent, where they followed through on the plans that God had for us ever since Adam and Eve fell in the garden, right? Someday he was going to send Messiah. He told Abraham, through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. He always knew what he was going to do. Pharisees didn't know. Herod didn't know. Pilate didn't know. The people didn't understand. The disciples didn't understand. But Jesus and his Father, they knew, and they got the job done. Would you pray with me, please? Father, we thank you for everyone who is watching and who is studying your word together. We pray that as we are separated, that you will keep us safe, that you would give us strength and hope, and that soon and very soon we can be back together and study your word in the same place at the same time. It's in Jesus that we pray. Amen. All right. If you need us, holler at us. There are communion sets in the fellowship room on the dessert table. So if you want to pick up those for your at-home communion needs, feel free to come by. If you don't have a key, holler and we'll come let you in. Talk to you later. Be careful. Bye.